Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session of UCalgary's webinar series presented in partnership with our campus mental health strategy. I'm Deborah Yedlin, and I'll be your moderator today. If you've participated in one of our previous webinars, welcome back. I hope you've had a good summer. And to all our viewers, thanks for joining us. As we continue to navigate the pandemic, UCalgary remains committed to our community by sharing the knowledge of our experts and providing opportunities to connect and discuss the challenges that affect us. The past few months have challenged us all in different ways. There isn't anyone who hasn't felt overwhelmed, lonely, anxious, and sad at some point since we went into lockdown in March. And now we're navigating our reentry, back to school, daycare, the office, and this is causing new stresses. Whether it is going back to work, starting school, or needing to provide more care for elderly parents, there is no relief from feeling overwhelmed and anxious. And the media headlines don't help, and nor does the fact that it takes much longer to do routine errands, and the snow yesterday didn't help either. Everything seems off. Today, we're talking to Dr. Keith Dobson, Professor of Clinical Psychology who leads UCalgary's Depression Research Laboratory. He'll share tips for managing our mental health as we return to work, send kids back to school, and university classes begin again. He'll start us off with a presentation and then answer questions from the audience. If you have a question during the webinar, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. This webinar will be available on demand, and we will email you a link once it's online. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're recording this webinar on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Dr. Keith Dobson is a professor of clinical psychology. His research interests are cognitive behavior therapy, depression, and psychopathology. Keith, you were with us in March when this challenging period began. Thanks for joining us again. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Chancellor Yedlin. Yes, indeed, we did this previously once before, and hopefully we won't have to do it too many more times. It's unfortunate that the pandemic continues to be with us and appears to be that it will be for some time to come. I'd also like to thank the University of Calgary for putting on these seminars. I understand that there are a lot of people who've registered today for this session, so this must obviously be meeting a need in the community, and I'm happy to be part of this response. I also wanted to say that if there are specific questions that people have that we can't address in the time that we have, I'm happy to respond to them later. So my university website or email is on the university website, and I'm happy to respond to issues as well. So just like to take a few minutes and talk about some background, which might help to set a bit of the context for some of the questions, or might even preempt perhaps some of the questions or anticipate some of them. And some of this is material that I've talked about before, so some of this actually covers some of the discussion we had back in the springtime. When we think about mental illness, though, we think about different risk factors. And again, you talked about the fact that I am responsible for the Depression Research Lab here at the University of Calgary. And depression is only one kind of mental illness, of course, or mental disorder that people can have. There are a whole host. And so to talk about them all as a single entity is really misleading in many respects. What we try to do is we try to talk about risk factors and resiliency factors or protective factors for a wide range of different disorders, and they do vary somewhat, and that hopefully will become a bit more clear today. But what we know about risk in general is that the risk can take many different forms. There is typically not one single factor that causes or explains mental health problems or mental illness for any one person. And our knowledge about these risk factors also evolves over time. Most people today take a comprehensive perspective and would use what we call a biopsychosocial framework. So this takes into account biological, psychological, and social risk factors that lead to or increase the risk of various mental health challenges. So the next slide. I could have the next slide. Thank you. These are some of the major biological risk factors that we know that can change the risk of mental illness or increase the risk. So genetic factors, family factors, neural structures, so aspects within the brain that potentially are related to specific mental disorders. The process of the brain and the brain functioning, so neurotransmission can certainly be implicated. Three I wanted to highlight that are relevant in the context of COVID-19. One is sleep dysregulation. So we know that many people, because of the anxiety and stress that they're experiencing with COVID-19, have had disturbed sleep. And this certainly is a biological process and has other biological effects as well. Autonomic nervous system arousal. Again, most people know about the fight or flight response. Some people talk about the fight, flight, or flee response, freeze response. So the idea that people, when they're faced with stress, have different kinds of reactions. And again, this is mediated through the autonomic nervous system. And this certainly is implicated in the context of stress and anxiety. And then gender. Unfortunately, we know that certain anxiety and depression problems are more frequent in females. Substance use and anger kinds of problems are more frequent in males in our society. And so gender is also implicated as a risk factor for different kinds of mental health challenges. Next slide. There are a whole host of psychological risk factors. One of the big factors associated with COVID-19 is unpredictability. So the idea that we can't really know what's going to happen or predict fully. Back in the spring again, when COVID-19 first broke, there was a lot of information that we didn't have. Today we have much more, but there's still a lot of missing pieces. We still don't know if we're going to have a vaccine or when. We don't know what form it might take, whether we'll need one injection or two, or again, how that's going to happen. We can't predict fully when outbreaks are going to occur and how to manage them. So again, there's a lot of unpredictability. And of course, COVID-19 is highly important to people, so we're tracking it. So from a psychological risk perspective, there's a lot here that's implicated. So our beliefs, our assumptions about the world and the way that it should operate, the way that we pay attention to information. You hinted already at the way that we pay attention to the media, maybe too much, but the way that we're selectively attending and responding. Pessimism, certainly as a psychological factor, has been present in many people. Negative and explanatory style is a factor where people look for negative information and tend to find it, so we confirm our biases through the way that we look for information. Rumination is certainly a factor. We know that, again, anxiety tends to be promoted mostly by worry about the future. Rumination more focuses on the past, so things that have happened. But there are a lot of negative events that have already occurred. So lost opportunity, lost jobs, loss of loved ones in some cases. So there's been a fair bit of rumination in society as well. Avoidance generally is associated with increased rates of stress and anxiety and depression. And again, we've certainly heard many cases of people becoming semi-escapist or avoiding certain responsibilities or concerns as a way of managing their stress. Next slide. Social risk factors. Again, we know that social risk factors increase the likelihood that people are going to have mental health challenges, including anxiety and depression. Some of these include parental style. So parents obviously have an impact on their children. And if their parenting style is anxious or avoidant themselves, they can pass this on to children. Children, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on the way you look at it, are an excellent barometer of the health of a family. And so if things are going not well, children will often demonstrate this. And of course, a specific concern around parenting right now is around return to school. Negative life events certainly are a factor here. Again, loss, unemployment, illness, relationship problems. We know that increased rates of domestic violence have been reported, and so it does appear that there's increased tension and stress in couples, not surprisingly. And social support. We know that low levels of social support are an ongoing risk factors for stress, anxiety, depression, amongst other mental health problems. And of course, in the context of COVID-19, we've been told explicitly that we should be engaging in physical distancing, although not social distancing, but there's obviously a link there between those. So there are a lot of biopsychosocial risk factors that have been implicated in the context of COVID-19. If we turn on the other side, the next slide talks about some resiliency factors or protective factors. And again, this is something I'm hoping that we'll get time to talk about today, because we know that in fact, if you can develop a balanced and recuperative temperament, so sort of more calm and relaxed to the extent that that's possible, this can help. Physical well-being, maintaining regular sleep, regular coping strategies, and engaging in positive, proactive steps are important. Trying to build a sense of competence, both physical, social, personal well-being and competence, and then relationships. Again, the lack of social contact and social relationships is a risk factor. So not surprisingly, we know that building positive relationships can be a protective factor to reduce the likelihood of mental health challenges. Next slide. So when you take all that, what can we do? So there are actually a number of recommendations I'm going to make, and I know that these are global or more general, and they may apply to some of the audience and perhaps not for others, but I'll put them out there. First, it's important, and we've been told this through public health people as well, but certainly it applies even at the individual mental health level, that we need to maintain our surveillance and our assessment. We should all be engaging in ongoing self-assessment, and we should be looking at the people around us and seeing how they're doing. And if we see concerns, we should be raising concerns with them. I'll be talking a bit more about that, how we can do that particular activity. We should try to do things that reduce our risks and increase our resilience. Again, I'll talk about a few of those strategies in just a second. We should certainly be asking our friends and families for support and also providing support to them. And if necessary, we should look at more formal services. And again, I'll come back to that in just a second. The next slide provides a framework. This is a framework that we've been using a fair bit in the work I've been doing with the Mental Health Commission of Canada, which, by the way, actually has a great resource website if people are interested in looking at materials related to COVID-19. But this particular tool is something called the Mental Health Continuum model. And what it tries to do is represent the idea of mental health on a continuum from green through red, using the color-coded scheme that people can see here. And it suggests that there are different signs and symptoms that we can look at that indicate if we're moving from the green or healthy functioning part of the scale up to the reacting scale part of the scale, yellow, orange, injured, and red, actually ill or diagnosable, potentially diagnosable. So recognizing that people can move up and down this continuum, again, that there are different signs and symptoms that people might express at different parts of the continuum that show how they're functioning. Just a couple things about the continuum. One is that you don't necessarily have all of your signs and symptoms in a single column. If you're feeling yellow today, for example, your functioning may be quite good, your behavioral functioning, but you might be feeling down. So there can be asynchrony or sort of breaks between these different components. But one of the nice things about the continuum model is it represents the idea that you can either move up or move down. You can do things to bring yourself back towards the green or into the green level of functioning. So it's been quite a useful tool for many people. It is available on the Mental Health Commission of Canada website. It's been used in our mental health strategy here at the University of Calgary, and it seems to be a generally applicable tool. So again, if people that are interested could go to those resources. Next slide. Again, this goes back now to some specific things that we can do. So some general recommendations to maintain our well-being, to reduce stress and risk of depression or other problems. Maintain our routines. Try to sleep regularly. I know, again, in the summer months, many people during holidays let their sleep cycles go off, but now that we're back to September and regular term, people should try to get up at irregular times, go to bed at a regular time. They should try to eat regularly. And again, each person has a slightly different eating cycle, but do something that's healthy for them. And of course, eating well in terms of the content of what they're eating as well. We should all try to get exercise. Again, health standards typically say something like 3 times a week, approximately minimum 20 to 30 minutes of aerobic exercise is healthy. More if you want, but at least do something that keeps your heart rate up and gets you going and breathing a bit. Get outside. We're lucky that, even though it did snow this weekend here in Calgary, the weather is still generally pretty good. So people should really get outside as much as they can. And even in winter, of course, in Canada, we can get out and ski and do other activities that maintain physical distancing. Watch your self-talk. Again, during the introduction, you talked about the fact that I've been involved in cognitive behavioral theory and therapy. And one of the things that we know pretty clearly is that the way you talk to yourself matters. If you're saying things that are negative and pessimistic, you'll probably tend to look for things that are negative in your environment. If you can challenge those thoughts with good evidence, or just simply trying to replace negative thoughts with positive thoughts, if that works for you, this can have quite a benefit. If you notice you're ruminating, you can pay attention to the content of what you're ruminating, but also pay attention to the process of rumination. When does it occur? Are certain people triggering you? Do you tend to ruminate after you watch the news? Right, these might be all clues to you that you want to change the process of how you're engaging in thinking. Media. The news cycle requires ongoing attention in media and hyper text, and it's really not that healthy. The amount of new good information coming out is not that much. I saw recently about somebody who's only listening to the media once a week and hasn't suffered a huge deficit of information as a consequence. So I think what you need to do as an individual, again, is think about how much your tolerance for information actually is, and then adjust your behavior accordingly. And then schedule activities. I recommend, generally speaking, that you try to schedule at least one pleasurable activity a day, something that you just simply enjoy. And again, what that is would be up to you. And one activity each day that gives you a sense of purpose. It might be something where you're starting to build an activity or build towards something, or it might be actually accomplishing some task, like a baking activity, for example. So whatever that is, it's up to you, but to do something in each of those domains each day with an idea to getting both pleasure and a sense of accomplishment. Next day, next slide rather. Keep your social contact. One of the things that I've been saying right throughout the entire pandemic is that even though we have to physically distance, we shouldn't be engaging in social distance. So again, whatever format that can take for you, reach out and do something that's going to keep you in contact with the people that you know and love. It's a challenge, but look for things that you can be grateful about. To practice acceptance and gratitude. It can be things like the fact that even though school's not ideal, at least the children are able to return to school. It could be remembering somebody who you've lost in the past and thinking about the things that you appreciated about them. So whatever that may be for you, again, practicing gratitude can be helpful. I heard Romeo Dallaire in one talk give a presentation, and he said that we should all try to find a cause. Find something bigger than ourselves and work towards it. So again, if you have the ability and the time and energy to engage in some social activity that's bigger than you, so, outside of your mindset, do it. That may be helpful. And when you're looking for information, look for good sources of information. We actually are lucky in Canada that we have very strong public health agencies and ministries of health, and we should all turn to them when we're looking for good pieces of information. Next slide. If it comes to the point where you recognize that your behavior has changed, or your thoughts are slipping, or your mood has gone down, and you think that you need a formal treatment, I have a few suggestions here. So again, I'm suggesting here that, in terms of the mental health continuum, you're probably shifting over to the orange, or maybe you just simply noticed that dramatic shift over a short period of time and you really want to do something about it. So a few things worth knowing. When it comes to validated treatments, this is obviously the thing that I think we should all look at first. Talking to a friend or a family member, there's nothing wrong with that at all, of course, but that's not formal treatment. So when we're looking for formal treatment, try to look at something that's been validated if possible. For many different mental health problems, there is no one treatment that is the best, that will always work for everyone. And so it may require you to actually do a bit of searching or talking to different health providers about what might work for you. Most of the validated treatments for mental health problems have roughly equal outcomes. So for some problems, there are better treatments than others, but again, that will vary depending on the condition. If one treatment doesn't work, another one may. And sometimes combining treatments will also have success where one alone may not. So again, sometimes it does take a bit of time to find the treatment that's going to be beneficial for each person. So again, work with your mental health professionals to try to find out which ones are going to work for you. The earlier you can get on treatment, the better the outcome. We also need to be mindful that in the context of COVID-19, some people have become quite depressed and hopeless. And with hopelessness, we do see an increased risk of self-injury or harm, self-harm. And so again, it's important sometimes for you, for your friends and loved ones, to be ready to ask difficult questions about their level of risk. And if necessary, get them to an emergency service so that they can get assessment. One of the guidelines documents I really like is the one at the bottom of this slide, which is the National Institute for Clinical Excellence in the United Kingdom. So it's nice.org.uk is the website. And they provide health guidelines for any health condition. And one of the things that I really like about their guidelines is that they're all evidence-based. So they have independent arm's length review panels that review the scientific data for all different health conditions and then make recommendations. Some of the recommendations are pretty technical and difficult to read, but they're actually very good. So I would recommend that. Next slide. We have lots of resources. Again, I've been remarkably impressed by how many people have been able to pivot or put their focus on COVID-19 and develop online resources or materials, many of which are evidence-based or at least you have a foundation in good evidence-based programs. So try to get your information from a well-developed resource, and if necessary, of course, see your family physician or get professional help. I have a few slides, next slide, actually, which talk about specific resources. So this next slide talks about the mental health strategy at the University of Calgary. And again, we're really lucky here that we have a very strong and robust mental health strategy. We have a strong team of people and a strong set of resources. This slide talks about the guiding principles for the development of the mental health strategy, so that it should be caring, collaborative, building resiliency, responding to the needs of people, and continuously improving through evaluation and ongoing development. So again, I think the strategy is already strong and getting stronger. Next slide. These are some of the resources that we have at the University of Calgary. So we have a very well-developed student wellness center. We have online resources. We have distress centers. There's actually a dedicated email site, sar@ucalgary.ca. So if somebody recognizes a student in distress, you can actually contact somebody and see if there's something that you can do as a resource provider resource. The Taylor Institute here at the University of Calgary is even developing resources for faculty about how to promote learning during COVID-19, with again, moving to online teaching and instruction. Next slide. These are resources for staff and faculty. So again, we have a very strong staff wellness service. So we have a mental health consultant who's available by day. We have, again, 24/7 distress lines. Homewood Health provides, again, 24/7 mental health support for faculty and staff that may feel like they need it. And again, the Taylor Institute is there doing their part in terms of resources for faculty and staff to help them deal with this pandemic situation. Next slide. Again, just a few updates about things that are happening. So this fall, the Student Wellness Center is starting a single session counseling module or format. And again, they're going to see how this works for students that have needs. There are some new workshops that are going on for staff, building resilience through connection. And again, looking at different ways to cope with various kinds of stressors and how to manage them. And then You Flourish is a program that happens here every fall. And again, they're going to have an online series of programs now focused on mental health resiliency and connection in October, from October, middle of October through the middle of November. And then I think the next slide is the last. Yes, which talks about community resources. So I won't go through all of these, but this is a short list of some of the community resources that exist. All of these slides, I should mention, are going to be available. They'll be posted after the presentation. And so people that are looking for resources can go to them. And again, I'll just restate, I guess, something I already did, which is that we're really lucky in Alberta and in Calgary at the University of Calgary that we have a lot of resources. People have done an amazing amount of work, trying to anticipate and then meet the needs of people struggling with stress, anxiety, depression, and other mental health problems. So with that, I'll stop. That took a bit longer than I'd hoped, but maybe we can turn to questions or discussion.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for your presentation. And I'm going to just kick it off with one of the things I've heard I've been hearing increasingly over the last couple of weeks, and it's this, summer's over, and of course, Labor Day was yesterday. The days are getting shorter. We did have a little bit of snow yesterday, and I keep hearing things like, I'm not ready for this. I'm worried about winter. What if we get locked down again? How am I going to cope? I've been outside a lot this summer. I will not be able to do that when it gets colder. There's a lot of anticipatory anxiety swirling, it seems. And so how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so again, I'll just sort of step back from the specific questions for a moment, but the questions that you've been posing again are just that they're anticipating the future.
Mm-hmm.
And this is when we know people get stressed and anxious, of course, is that when we look to the future and we don't really know what's going to happen, or we anticipate that something bad is coming down the line and we don't quite know how to cope with it, that's when stress and anxiety tends to increase in rates. And realistically, all we can do, I would say, is try to predict stressors as best we can. So we know, for example, it's going to be getting cold. And maybe that it was a bit of a blip, hopefully, but we know it's going to be getting cold again. So if you can think about and anticipate or plan for ways that you can cope with that now, that's a great thing to do. So for example, developing walking groups in the malls, it would be the kind of thing that I would think about for people that want to and are able to get outside to do skiing or skating. Again, this is perfect physical distance activity. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. But now is a good time to, again, anticipate how you're going to manage those events. It's a great time. September is a great time to register for online courses. So again, if you're concerned about being locked inside and not necessarily having things to do, if you wait until October sometimes to register for courses, they're already operating. So now is the time to look at these if you want to engage in those kinds of activities. So again, I think predicting as much as we can, controlling what we can, taking responsibility and taking steps now for what we can. These are the best things that we can do.
One of the things you talked about, the importance, physical distance being important, but social distancing, not a good idea. Right. And yet people are getting tired of the Zoom calls. At the beginning, there were these Zoom cocktail hours, people were getting together online. They're tired of the intermediary platform. And they're feeling like their connections are fraying as a result.
Yes.
What, do you have any other options that people might consider to maintain or reignite that contact?
Well, again, I think we're still learning about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So again, in the early days of the pandemic, of course, we were told that masks alone may not be sufficient, but now we're told, with masks, perhaps we can actually have more physical contact. Schools, we've actually been told now that, the 2 meters distance maybe isn't really necessary, that we can reduce it. So I think we're still learning more about the nature of COVID-19 itself and how to respond. But I don't have any great ideas. Again, I think, we need to use the online platforms that we have. I have heard a lot of people talk about Zoom fatigue, that they're tired, and there certainly is something about talking to a computer monitor that is not the same as talking to people. So look for informal sources of contact, I would say. I would recommend, in fact, I know we've done a bit more of it in our home, using the phone more. Because again, it's
interesting.
A bit more intimate in a different way. You don't see the person, of course, but in some ways it gives you freedom to do things that, again, you can't do on a computer technology. So shake it up, I would say. I know a lot of people, again, in the early days were doing things like cocktail hours, and now they've stopped. So maybe go back. Game night. Again, I think, doing game nights, there are certain games like word games that you can play across different spaces. So again, that becomes possible. So there,
Question from a, sorry, there's a question from a grad student who's been away from his office, and he says he's finding it really hard to focus on researching and he gets distracted. What do you suggest
well,
in terms of helping him cope and get
I'm going to
focused?
get in
And
trouble
I mean,
here
you
now
talked about
myself.
little distractions as something to do with purpose, like baking. I think we've all been doing a lot of baking, so maybe something else.
Yeah, I'm going to get in trouble here, perhaps myself, but I'm actually at my university office, and we've been told now recently that we're allowed to use the university, our offices, as long as we maintain physical distancing and as long as we follow the protocols. So I've personally been coming into my office because I do the same thing. When I'm at home, I find things that need to be done that don't necessarily actually have to be done. So as part of my own self-discipline, I've been doing that. Again, different people have different schedules. So I would say that if you find that you're a more effective worker in the morning, get up as early as you can, get your work done, and then give yourself some permission to take a break and then come back to it. And these are sort of some of the strategies. If you're more efficient in the afternoon, give yourself permission to go for a walk outside or do something else in the morning and then come back to it in the afternoon. But again, I think just, there's no magic, I don't think, in the strategy here. It's a matter of figuring out what's going to work the best for you and then being consistent and apply them.
And maybe being flexible in terms of what your expectations are. Be willing to try something different every day. If one thing doesn't work, try something else.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And again, sometimes thinking outside of the box. So for example, it might be that if you're trying to just discipline yourself to get something done and that's not working for you, maybe try to do it in a way that's a bit more social. So then you have a contact at 5 o'clock in the afternoon after the day is done where you report in and say what you've done. That may actually help to motivate you. Some writers I know sort of will set a certain period of time. And they just simply say, for this period of time I'll work, and when I'm done, even if I'm still being productive, I'll get up and walk away because then I'll sort of have something to come back to the next time I'm working.
My kids used to ask their friends to change their Facebook passwords so they couldn't get distracted. That seemed to work.
Yeah. So again, different people need self-discipline of different types, for sure. Yeah.
So a couple of questions have come into this, I guess I'm going to call it Zoom fatigue. Some people have health risks, so they're very mindful of what they're going to expose themselves to, and they're feeling lonely. How do you find new friends in isolation? Is it a function of finding chat rooms, signing up for classes, and maybe, having those devolve into some seminar groups? Just curious. And of course, if you have older parents, you also have to be mindful of not exposing them to something. So as you feel like you're very constrained on a bunch of different levels, but the friend piece, the social interaction is so important right now.
Yeah.
What do you advise?
Again, each person's going to have to find their own strategy, of course. But I mean, some of the things that come to mind are to reach out to people that you've known in the past and maybe haven't talked to or been with recently. So I know I've personally done that. Sort of sent emails to people that I might have seen this summer in other places, and just simply talking to them or emailing in some cases. So I think that's something you can do to rebuild or reestablish connections. I think signing up for new courses or new materials or new programs is a great idea. I think many of them, unfortunately, are going to be online, but there are a number that I know that are going to be in person, so you get a chance for a bit more informal contact. Look for opportunities, I think, for friends and families to get together. Again, most people at this point, I think, have a kind of a bubble that they've created, or sort of a network of people with whom they can meet and will meet on a regular basis. So look at that bubble. If it's not big enough, maybe expand it a little bit, or look for opportunities to do that. And then I think the other is, like you said, online kinds of technologies. So there are still online dating platforms, and there are ways to reach out to people. Not ideal, not the best, of course, but certainly can stand in for a while.
So, with all the messaging that we're seeing, whether, there was an article in the Globe about the numbers starting to creep up, and there's still a lot of alarmist headlines and news items that we're hearing. So that's got a lot of people anxious and sort of thinking about, how should I prepare for a second wave? Or is that even advisable?
Yeah, unfortunately, I do think it is. One of the things we are starting to get is pretty good, consistent data now about mental health challenges associated with COVID-19. I'm aware of 3 national surveys that have been done in Canada that have asked for self-reports of stress and anxiety. And these are all reasonably large, like about 1,800 participants each, so reasonably good data. And they all suggest that rates of stress and anxiety and self-reported depression have gone up. We've just finished, in fact, a literature review, a very quick literature review that's now in review at a journal, looking at the published articles that have already come out in the first 6 months of this pandemic, looking at estimated rates of anxiety and depression. And it looks like and again, most of the studies quality varies somewhat, but based on the better study articles, better quality articles, it's about 2 to 2.5 times increased rates of anxiety and depression around the world. And most of the earliest studies, of course, are in countries like China, where the pandemic first broke. But the data does appear to suggest that we're going to see increased rates of anxiety and depression. I don't know if you remember, but way back when we first spoke, I said to you that we've seen rates of anxiety and stress go up fairly dramatically in the short term. And that as the pandemic continued, what I expected was that rates of depression would sort of catch up somewhat later on, because anxiety is a future-oriented emotion. Depression tends to be more past-oriented. You get depressed about things that have already happened. And we're also seeing now increased rates of domestic violence, unfortunately. And we're also seeing increased rates of substance use, so alcohol use and some things like that. Not as dramatic as anxiety and depression, fortunately, but there is some good evidence that these rates are going up as well. So unfortunately, when it comes to a second wave, I think from a mental health perspective, we're already there. I don't think we'll probably see a second wave of anxiety and depression. I think we're there in terms of national crisis.
But do you anticipate it getting worse as, some people already suffer from seasonal affective disorder and just the constraints that are put on individuals as a result of the weather, shorter days, colder temperatures?
We do see a slight bump in depression rates in the winter months with seasonal depression in the northern climates like Canada. But superimposed on top of COVID-19, I actually don't think it's going to be as great this year. So again, if our rates are currently about 2 or 3 times what they normally are, somewhere in that ballpark, my guess is we won't see that much. But one of the real challenges, of course, is that mental health challenges don't affect everybody equally. They're not an equal employer, so to speak. People that are already disadvantaged either have health problems or are already socially isolated, people with economic challenges, newcomers to Canada, Indigenous peoples, generally speaking, they're sort of variety of sort of at-risk groups. And these mental health challenges, unfortunately, again, disproportionately affect those groups.
Question about, what are your thoughts on EFT tapping as a coping strategy? I don't know what EFT is, but maybe you can explain what that is and perhaps describe why it might be helpful.
I'm not I think I know what the person is referring to, the person with the question is asking about, but can they say what EFT stands for them?
Yeah, I don't know what it is. I'm just asking. I don't know if the audience who's listening knows what EFT is. So they just said EFT. So perhaps you can just say what it stands for. And
there is an approach called emotion-focused therapy, but I'm not sure what they're talking about, if that's what they're talking about. Tapping is usually associated, though, more as a distraction technique and a coping technique for stress and anxiety. There is some evidence that it can have benefit. It's not on the list of evidence-based therapies currently, if that's what the reference is to. So I guess, I don't want to be too definitive since I'm not exactly sure what the question is about.
Sure.
Yeah.
Now, as people are starting to go out into the community, there's a general amount of anxiety of going into the community when you're taking responsibility for yourself and, let's say, protecting others by and making sure that you're wearing a mask. There's a lot of mask shaming going on, and what happens if you can't avoid it? You have to go and, let's say, access services, but there's not conformity in terms of practice and precautions. What do you suggest people do? Do you say something? Do you walk away? Do you avoid?
So,
What's the best option?
so is the question from people that want to wear masks?
No, I think it's from someone who sees others who refuse to do that or take precautions and then put other people at risk.
Okay, so it's interesting. So my experience in the recent past has been stores have been very good about having signage that says you must wear a mask to come into this public place.
Right.
Many stores actually have people standing at their doorway, just making sure that you have one. And some of them, in fact, will almost insist on spraying your hands with something to make sure that your hands are clean as you come in. So stores vary somewhat. But I guess my own recommendation is that if it's a place where people should be wearing masks in public, basically where you can't engage in physical distancing, you should wear your own mask, of course. And if somebody is not wearing a mask, you either step away or you suggest to them that they should be wearing a mask. Certainly, again, I've felt comfortable, and nobody has yet been angry with me suggesting to people that they should have their mask, or some people wear their mask under their nose, and I've suggested that they should pull it up. And so, again, I haven't had the response yet of anger, but I have heard of that. I have heard of some people becoming angry about, having to wear masks. In those cases, my general suggestion would be walk away and go find somebody who's responsible within the store, and
Right.
just point them out and have somebody who has the responsibility to enforce mask wearing to do that.
And if you're stuck on the C train or some sort of transit?
Yeah, it's the same. Again, I would gently suggest to people or remind them that they should be wearing it. Like I would actually show them, pull up your mask. You can't make them, and I certainly would never try to physically, try to get somebody to put on a mask. So you can do that, and then again, move away, and then potentially call an authority figure.
I guess the thing is, obviously, when you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, and somebody else isn't, the anxiety factor starts to creep up.
Sure.
That person's not doing what they're supposed to do. They're putting me at risk.
Sorry,
so what do you do? Like that can spiral out of control pretty quickly. In terms of how you're feeling, is there anything you can do in terms of self-talk to sort of quieten the anxiety so that you're not whipped into a frenzy by the time you get off the bus or the train?
Sure. I think you can say things like, what's the realistic risk? And again, one of the difficulties we have with COVID-19 is we don't actually know. So again, I think what many people will do is go to the possibility that they're being infected and, that something's going to happen and they're going to bring it home to their family member and, all of the consequences. But the likelihood that that's in fact going to occur is pretty small. So again, if you can maintain some physical distance, if you can move away from the person who's perhaps not being responsible, recognize that they may not be infected in the first place, so they probably shouldn't be out if they're already infected. And even if they were, the chance of you becoming infected is not that great in any event. So even if you're in the same space as a bus or a C train with somebody who is infected, the chance of you catching the virus and then it sort of taking hold is not that great. I've heard some recent data, and again, I don't know if this is valid or not myself, so maybe I shouldn't even be repeating it, but I've been hearing some recent questions about whether you can actually catch COVID on a hard surface, for example, that somebody... So there's still a lot of science, I think, that's questionable. So again, I would just sort of say to myself, well, what's the likelihood that I'm actually going to be infected? Am I wearing my mask to protect myself? If you've been in touch with somebody who's not being responsible, you can disinfect your hands fairly quickly and do things again to minimize your risk exposure.
And I guess there's always a risk too that sometimes people can't wear them for other reasons, and so you could end up in a different situation if you confront them.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, and some people, in fact, with panic attacks, for example, find it very challenging to wear masks. And so again, if you're making assumptions about why they're not wearing a mask because they're being disrespectful of others, that may not be valid as well.
Correct. Yeah, I think that's about some self-compassion and compassion for others. You can't see everything through your own lens. Somebody has just sent in a note saying, you know, they find they would rather be in the workplace, and they're finding it really hard to deal with everything via email. And I think that's, you know, people are finding the world a bit more cumbersome, and there's a lot of transactional friction because you have to schedule something that otherwise would happen spontaneously, and it takes a lot of energy. So I guess, are there any ideas? So that sort of tends to also increase that feeling of isolation. So any thoughts on perhaps giving some advice to this individual about what they should do to handle their work situation?
I've heard this concern again, you know, that we've lost for the time being, at least some of the informal, sort of very quick sort of chat by the water cooler kind of a discussion. And so some people who want to get back to the workplace, because then it gives them that chance for informal contact or lunchroom contact. Again, I think it's going to be different for a while, unfortunately. But this is what I was hinting at earlier when I say you could pick up the phone. Again, the phone is a sort of a quicker, more immediate way to communicate. You also don't have to schedule it necessarily. So you can have a fast, off the cuff kind of a discussion. You're also not doing it visually, so it's less formal in that sense.
Right.
But I've heard a lot of this concern again about, you know, just to have a meeting now, you have to talk to somebody, email with them 3 or 4 times to nail down a time. Then you have to schedule the Zoom or other technology, you know, in order to have the face-to-face contact. So it is cumbersome for sure, the current way. I have heard of some organizations who are taking the time to do Monday morning informal chats.
Yeah.
So just, you know, like not a particular meeting or agenda, but just a chance for people to get together and, you know, sort of share ideas. In my department here at the University of Calgary, one of the faculty members has started to organize informal groups. So again, no particular agenda, but just, you know, a group of people that you would be meeting with on an irregular basis to just talk about issues. So again, it's like the informal water cooler. So again, I think there are different strategies like that. One of the things, again, I'll just mention my department head. I give him a lot of credit. Keith Yates is his name. But he's been sending out regular messages to the department, and again, just keeping everybody up to date with what's happening. So, and it's formal news, but it's also a little bit of, you know, oh, did you know that so-and-so, you know, just had an accomplishment, you know, so it's a little bit gossipy as well, or newsy.
Yeah.
Which I think, again, is very helpful. So there's a few things that people can do.
We've heard a lot and we've read a lot about the stresses being faced by the frontline healthcare workers. As someone who's doing COVID testing, other than wearing proper PPE, do you have any suggestions to help with decreasing anxiety as they are exposing themselves every day? And likely wearing a lot of cumbersome clothing to make sure that they're protected, but still, I mean, I think it's probably pretty hard to set aside how you're putting yourself at risk on a daily basis.
Oh, yeah, and in fact, you probably don't want to in some respects, because you know, you run the risk of becoming somewhat lazy then. So in fact, you have to maintain all of these standards and maintain all of these activities. So you have to remind yourself every day to be vigilant. And again, I think our bodies are structured in terms of stress and anxiety systems, typically better for short-term acute stressors. So, you know, the fight or flight or freeze response, you know, works best for short-term physical stressors. It works less well for chronic invisible stressors like COVID-19, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. So I think it's very natural that we're going to get a sense of fatigue, and we're going to get a sense that, you know, we're just tired of maintaining our vigilance as, you know, as long as we have to. So I think, again, from time to time, giving yourself permission to be tired, you know, to feel fatigued, to take a break, you know, so to speak, and then get back to it. I think that's perfectly fine. This is part of the idea, again, about being compassionate or being thankful about the things that you can do and the way that you maintain yourself. Yeah, but I think being a frontline worker must be extremely challenging. Teachers, again, are another group that, you know, with this school, the return to school, they're being asked to take on similar kinds of roles, and it's going to be increasingly challenging for teachers as well, I think.
How concerned are you? So the teachers are one group, one cohort, but the kids that are coming to school, how concerned are you about their mental health as they are in a significantly different situation, and the restrictions are different, and perhaps programming isn't the same. How worried are you that this is really going to transmit on a, I wouldn't say permanent basis, but it's going to be very challenging for the students as well?
Yeah, I think this is a real worry for Canadian society, and not, of course, not just Canadian society, but societies that are facing this issue. There's no doubt that for some people, depending on the age that they are, that they're hitting important developmental milestones in terms of their relationships and how they think about themselves and their sense of who they are as a person, which will carry forward for years, if in some cases maybe for the rest of their life. And so to the extent that those relationships are perturbed or interfered with, I think there is a risk for some people, without a doubt. So for example, if you're at an age where you want to start dating for, sort of your, let's say, early years of high school, and you want to start forming intimate relationships or just flirting even, not necessarily wanting an intimate relationship, and you can't do that, or that it's significantly different, you might end up with a very different sense of yourself as an adult than you would have otherwise. How can we protect students against that? I think by getting them into the classroom as much as possible with as normal as possible relationships. And there are different ways of doing that. So for example, one of the things I've heard about, some schools are moving away from the regular 2 semester system to the quarter system, so that the students tend to stay together for longer periods of time within the 2 months. I guess it's more like, I don't know the exact time, but within the period of their quarter courses. So it allows them, again, more contact with their cohort for that period of time. And I think that's one way to potentially compensate for what might otherwise be some of the loss of social contact.
And could you offer some suggestions in terms of formal supports other than counseling, that are helpful in addressing depression and anxiety? What else would you suggest for people in terms of support systems, coping?
Yeah, so again, the slides that I talked about earlier talked about risk factors, and then also talked about resiliency factors. So I would, again, in my own mind, I'm going back to that list of resiliency factors. So trying to build a sort of balanced sense of self, eating well, sleeping well, trying to have some exercise, as much as possible, maintaining social contacts, finding a sense of purpose to the extent you can, engaging in things that are bigger than you, these kinds of ideas. These would be all those kinds of strategies I'd be thinking about and recommending. There are many, many online resources, like right. Almost. So finding the one that works for you, again, would be the kind of thing that I would suggest. Again, trying to be as thankful and sort of recognizing the benefits that you have as much as possible, again, would be something that I think for most people would be helpful.
One of the things I've been reading is about the importance of having a flexible mindset. And this is something that seems to have surfaced a little bit more broadly recently. I'm just curious as if you could talk about a flexible mindset and how this can help in terms of what we're dealing with now, and perhaps some tips on how to develop that in order to help us cope.
So one of the things that we do know in psychology is that as people grow, they tend to develop certain beliefs about themselves, beliefs about the world, and they tend to become somewhat more rigid over time. So we as humans naturally try to reduce the amount of information we have to cope with, and we develop what are called heuristics, heuristic frameworks for looking at information and filtering information. So we tend to look for information that fits with our worldview, tend to look for information that sort of matches our sense of self. In the same way, we tend to disconfirm or ignore information that doesn't fit. So we sort of develop in more and more inflexibility or more rigidity over time. This is sort of a common strategy. So it has been shown that, in fact, people that can maintain a sense of flexibility and are open to experience and are open to new information, and especially contradictory information, tend to have somewhat better health than people that are cognitively rigid. So again, I would say that in general, I would agree that cognitive flexibility is a preventive factor and something that you should try to develop. How do you do that? That's the challenge. I think what you
Yeah.
have to do is be open to experience. You have to be willing to try things that you wouldn't necessarily, to take the risk to embarrass yourself, perhaps, to start a new program that maybe you'll never finish, so even with the idea that you don't intend to finish it, but you just want to experience it. And again, there are lots of resources and programs, many online, but again, there are a lot of things that are actually happening in person that you can continue to do. I know that there are many local experiences. For example, I've seen just recently Indigenous communities are setting up lived experiences, again, following physical safety and social physical distancing rules. So there are experiences that you can have even in these pandemic times.
One other question about explaining the differences between neural structures and neurobiology by adopting brain science. Just wondering if you could answer that.
Yeah. So I think that references to one of the slides I showed. And what I was talking there was about both the structures of the brain and then the operations of the brain.
Okay.
So there are certain parts of the brain that are implicated in certain kinds of mental disorders more than others. Like specific locations or areas of the brain. And then there's the ways that the brain communicates within itself, which is more of the process of neurotransmission. So you may have intact brain structures, but if they're not communicating well, you can have certain kinds of problems. Or in the longer term, in some cases, there's evidence that there are actually changes in brain structure itself, which can lead to longer term things, so the longer term problems. So I'm thinking there about dementia, for example. There's
right.
That the brain structures themselves change over time, and that becomes much more problematic then. Yeah, generally speaking, for stress, what we know is that it's not that the brain structures themselves change, but rather they're overstimulated. They're overactivated. Right. And so if we can find strategies to either reduce the activation in the short term, calm the self, distracts perhaps in some cases, engage in mindfulness or relaxation efforts, we can actually calm the mind, but we're not changing the structure of the brain. We're just changing the way it's operating.
So, we've had 6 months of dealing with the, for a while, a complete lockdown. Are we better off in terms of dealing with the uncertainty? Do you think as a population, we've developed the coping mechanisms that are helpful and we're further ahead?
Can I call it a work in progress?
A work in progress, okay.
And again, when the pandemic first hit, of course, we didn't know how long that it was going to last, how long it would be with us. I know there was some hope that, it might sort of have a crust and then fall away. It's pretty clear, I think, at this point that it's going to be with us for a longer period of time. I think everybody is predicting that we will have outbreaks in the schools, and there will probably need to be, if not general, location-specific lockdowns, where people have been exposed. So I think this is going to be with us for a while. My own personal sense is that, we probably will see a vaccine. When? I don't know. I don't think it's going to be in the near future, but hopefully at some point we'll see the vaccine, and this will probably be the time when we can start to turn the corner.
Well, Dr. Dobson, I really want to say thank you so much for your thoughts today. I know that everybody was very engaged in terms of the questions that were coming through, and you gave us another way to look at the situation we're dealing with. And I suspect we'll do this again before everything starts to change, but thanks so much for joining us. And hopefully we have more encouraging things to talk about when we have you on next. Okay, thanks very much. And thanks to everyone for being here.
Thank you for your support for this work.
Thank you very much. And just before we go, I'd like to remind our community that mental health supports continue to be available, as we saw on the slides that will be made available for the attendees online. This webinar is just one of more than 25 virtual programs that are going to be held through September for Alumni Month. In celebration of our 190,000 strong UCalgary alumni community, we have curated an exciting selection of programs featuring alumni who will inspire you, conversations that will inform you, and expertise that will guide you. I encourage everyone to check out the entire Alumni Month schedule at alumni.calgary.ca/alumni. Thanks again for joining us. and we'll see you soon.